If you see a picture of me and you see the background, that's what is called the Knott Memorial. That is the only 16-sided building in the Western Hemisphere. And on top of it is a statement, believe it or not, from the Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, which runs something like this. The day is short, the work is long and hard, the workers are sluggish, and the master is waiting. It's a very famous statement. I'm not doing it verbatim. That's an elegant way of saying there's a lot to cover today, and we're going to do it in rapid fashion. So please hang on. Please hang on to me. I left you the last time with the October or November Revolution in Russia. And now it's October, November, depending on which calendar you're looking at. But the point, really the most important point of all, you remember I used the terminology, this is the second and greatest secular messianic movement in history. The French Revolution, remember, liberté, égalité, fraternité, that was designed not only for the French people, for people all over Europe, if not all over the world. The last statement in the Communist Manifesto, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. That was to be, this Lenin or Bolshevik revolution was designed really to spread to the rest of the world. And it would be very, very important. That is, all over the world, people will hear the call. The young Ho Chi Minh was a waiter in Paris. He would hear the call. The young Mao Zedong in Shanghai, he would hear the call as well. And in fact, I think I mentioned this to you before, a very succinct way of describing the 20th century is that you cannot understand or come close to understanding the 20th century unless you understand the appeal of communism and the fear of communism. When the communists came to power, remember, Bolshevism and communism are one and the same. Lenin changed the name of the Bolshevik Party to the Communist Party in order to say, well, he was saying, we're going to create a new society. There were only two people that objected to this in the left. And that was, again, Rosa Luxemburg, the Polish Jew from Zamość in Poland, and of course, the American revolutionary Emma Goldman. They both believed that Lenin had usurped the political process. That is, in their eyes, at least for a time, they believed that the only way Lenin should have come to power in Russia was by the electoral system. He did not do that. He took power and then presented the Soviet of Petrograd workers and Soviets and Petrograd workers and soldiers deputies with a fait accompli. So there was no real opposition except for Emma Goldman and Rosa Luxemburg. If you want to get a sense of the impact on the American left of the communist seizure of power in October of 1917, I recommend a golden oldie, a film for you. That's the film Reds. And in Reds, the central character is going to be John Reed. John Reed is the first American whose ashes will be buried in the Kremlin wall. He went over there and he thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And what's going to happen is he will write a book about this, 10 Days That Shook the World, that will be made into a film. This will spread the idea, disseminate the idea that this was a wonderful revolution, that the world is a better place for it, and we are close to coming into the secular messianic age. What Lenin did in Russia is, of course, I mentioned this to you before, the Lenin Decree on Land, the end of all sorts of, let's say, liberties within Russia, but most important of all, Lenin signed an armistice with the Germans in December of 1917. With that, the Germans began to shift troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. And then in March of 1918, Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This was, the Germans were dissatisfied with an armistice. They wanted a peace treaty, and they wanted an arm and a leg from Russia. And the Bolshevik, or the Communist Central Committee, told Lenin, we cannot accept this. The Russian people will not accept this, because the Germans wanted 60% of European Russia. But Lenin, this is again what I told you before, this is what charisma is all about. Lenin got the Central Committee to accept the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk by threatening to resign from the party if it didn't accept it and to go into opposition. And Trotsky said, Bolshevism without Lenin is inconceivable. And Lenin also said, correctly, for the most part, Lenin said, we cannot fight the civil war against the whites and fight the Germans at the same time. Let us make concessions to the Germans, and Lenin was correct in saying that the Germans will lose the war. The Americans are coming in, Germany will lose the war. Whatever we give to the Germans, we'll get back. Because when Germany loses the war, their soldiers will retreat from the occupied areas of Russia, will send the new Red Army on the heels of the retreating Germans, and we will get back whatever we lost. Now, that's partially true. We'll deal with that somewhat later, or it's in the first section that we have next week. But here's the important point, the most important point of all. After the armistice in December of 1917, the Germans shifted forces from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. They will commence on March 21st of 1918, Operation Michael. This is the ultimate rolling of the dice by the Germans. General Ludendorff has told the Kaiser, we are within sight of victory. One last push will crack through the Allied lines before the Americans get there in force. One last push, and we will again bring an end to the war. And so, up on March 21st of 1918, the Germans advance. For 3 days, the Germans have their way. The Germans crack through the British lines, crack through the French lines. Paris is once again within sight. On March 23rd or March 24th, the Kaiser proclaims victory is in sight and demands or proclaims or asks that all the church bells in Germany should be rung. The long-awaited victory is coming. But it is not going to come, and it will not come for a variety of reasons. The brunt of the German attack falls on the British lines. The British lines crack and they reform. The British retreat, then they advance. In fact, a term is used. Now you're going to be surprised when I tell you this, because it is a term used by Winston Churchill in World War I, talking about the British resilience in dealing with the Germans in 1940. The term that is used, it's the same words actually. That is, it will be said that the finest hour of the British Army in the history of the British Empire is in March and April of 1918. The British hang on. This is the time when the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, Sir Douglas Haig, the very controversial Sir Douglas Haig, the man that was called the Butcher of the Somme, he issues an order to the British in March of 1918. With our backs to the wall, and faith in that our cause is just, no British soldier is to retreat. You are to stand your ground. How much of an impact that I do not know, but the British maintain their lines. They break, they reform, the Germans are stopped. That's the crucial point. In addition to that, for the first time in the history of World War I, German discipline collapses. That is, the blockade has had an impact on the German army as well as upon German civilians. When the Germans advance, they break their lines and they loot French villages and French farms. They get inebriated, large numbers of them. Discipline breaks down. For the first time in World War I, discipline in the German army breaks down. So, the breakdown of discipline in the German army, and of course, the resilience of the British, and to a certain extent the French in this period of time, and the coming into play of American forces. This is going to turn the tide of battle. And by September, late August, September of 1918, the Allies go on to the offensive. It is in this period of time that a little known, but perhaps the greatest battle in American military history will take place. That is, there are more than 1 million men. In no other battle in the history of our country were more than 1 million men committed to one battle. This is the Battle of the Argonne Forest. It is a monumental battle. We take heavy, very heavy casualties. We do not learn the lessons that the British and the French had learned. No longer are there the frontal attacks, massive waves of attacking cut down by German machine guns. Now they go around the flanks. Now they show more mobility. Now the British and the French, particularly the British, have tanks. A tank is one of the great weapons developed in the First World War. The British are quick in using the tank. By the end of the war, the British have 12,000 tanks. The Germans have less than 12. Surprisingly, the Germans, who are so good in adapting to the military contingencies of the First World War, are not quick on the uptake in dealing with the tank. What it is all going to lead to is, and it rolls off like a litany, my friends, you've heard it, we all heard it in high school and elementary school. The war comes to an end the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. The war is over. But I must tell you, with burning sorrow, some British soldiers or British commanders, that is colonels, usually colonels, and majors who are on the front line, they hear in the early morning of November 11th that the war is going to be over. The guns will cease firing on November 11th. Is it overzealousness on their part? They order in some parts of the front, knowing that the guns are going to fall silent at 11 a.m., some British commanders ordered their soldiers to take the offensive. Thousands of British soldiers will be killed and wounded in the first hours of November 11th of 1918. It is the height of folly, a quintessential example of folly during World War I. So the war comes to an end. The war to end all wars, right? But it doesn't. Let's talk a little bit about the political, social, economic, scientific consequences of the war. I begin with, again, the greatest myth of the 20th century will emerge very quickly after November 11th. This is the myth, please hold on to this. This is the myth of the Dolchstoß in German, the stab in the back. Now, everything must be seen in context. The war ends at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. The last German offensive was in June of 1918. When the war ended, the Germans were still, when they signed the armistice, the Germans were still in control of a good part of France and nearly all of Belgium. The German people had been told by the Kaiser and by Ludendorff, one last push. There's light at the end of the tunnel. One last push and our gallant soldiers will reach the Channel ports and we will defeat the Allies. Victory is in sight. And then all of a sudden, in the eyes of many Germans, the war comes to an end. How could we have lost? We're deep in France. We have all of Belgium. The last German offensive again is in June of 1918. There's light at the end of the tunnel, we have been told. Remember what I told you in an earlier lecture. In war, the first casualty is the truth. The myth, the idea spreads. Our soldiers would have won the war had they not been stabbed in the back. Stabbed in the back by the Jews, the communists, the Masons, the trade union people, and the socialists. In reality, there were socialist and communist revolts and military mutinies in Germany in the second half, or really beginning even before the summer of 1918. So, does this impact the war? No. The war effort, the Germans lose the war because they bit off, the common expression, they bit off more than they could chew. The Germans had shot their bolt. They were exhausted. The Germans had no reserves anymore. Americans are coming in, 300,000 men a month. The British can draw on the French Empire. The French can draw on their empire. The resources of the Americans, the financial resources of the Americans are tremendous. The blockade is having an enormous impact upon the German army and upon German civilians. We believe that several 100,000 Germans starved. They died as a consequence of the blockade. Germany lost the war because it was defeated on the field of battle. That's the crucial point. But how many times have I said to you, perception is reality. That's the myth that the young Adolf Hitler is going to hear. He's lying in a bed, gassed, blind, temporarily blinded, and he hears that Germany has lost the war. He cannot believe it. Large numbers of Germans cannot believe it. And so the myth, that is, that the German army was stabbed in the back, Victory was stolen from us. We would have won. Our gallant soldiers are the best soldiers in the world. We would have won had they were not stabbed in the back. You cannot understand what's going to come in the future, in the interwar period and the rise of Nazis and Adolf Hitler. You cannot understand that unless you are familiar with the idea of the Dolchstoß. Then there is another consequence. The political consequences, as all these consequences, are monumental. The second consequence are the casualties and what the casualties lead to. Listen carefully to my figures. You know, if you're taking notes, some of you may be taking notes, don't take these down. Don't waste your time. Just get a sense of the magnitude. The French lost 1,336,000 men dead on a population base of 46 million. That is, again, on top of that, from the millions of the French wounded. England, the United Kingdom, will lose 800,000 men. To this day, you cannot go through a city, a town, or village to see a cenotaph, a memorial, and what it will say, they all say the same thing, to our glorious dead that died between 1914, who fell in the Great War, 1914 to 1918. Canada, if there are any Canadians out there, will lose 60,000 men on a population base of 12 million. We, in our country, we get away cheaply, but that's because we entered the war relatively late. We will lose about 106,000 men on a population base of 120 million. Those losses in World War I will have an enormous impact upon the way European countries, particularly the British and French, looked at the world in the 1920s and the 1930s. A wave of pacifism sweeps over Europe. And when we talk, beginning to the discussion of World War II next week, we will see the impact that that has. Nobody wants to go into the butcher's block. Nobody wants to go into the trenches once again. You cannot understand the reluctance of the European democracies and our own country to stand fast against Adolf Hitler in the 1930s unless you understand it against the background of these enormous casualties. And then there is something that I did not mention to you. It's worth a number of books in American history, but we never covered this. In high school, we never discussed this, and I suspect in most college history classes, they don't discuss this. But it is very, very important in the history of the new Soviet state. Remember what I told you. Armistice, 1917. Lenin pulls Russia out of the war. March 1918, again, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Forgive my crudeness, but in Washington, in London, and Paris, when they hear that Lenin is pulling Russia out of the war, they're pissing in their boots. They know what's going to happen, that the Germans will shift forces from the Eastern Front to the Western Front and put them in very great danger before the Americans get there in force. So what happens is very significant, not taught often, but very, very significant in Soviet history. The British, the French, the Japanese, Japan is our ally in World War I, and our own country, we invade the new Soviet state. This is what is known as the War of Allied Intervention. What we want to do is to help those anti-communist forces overthrow Lenin and the new Soviet state and rehabilitate, recreate the Eastern Front against the Germans. I'll say that again. The primary motivation for the War of Allied Intervention is we want to get the overthrow, help the anti-communist forces overthrow Lenin's new Soviet government and re-establish the Eastern Front against the Germans. That's the primary motive. Now, listen please again very carefully. Here's where the chronology becomes important. We invade, everybody invades March, April, May, June. Everybody is invading. All the allies are sending troops to accomplish what I said that they should accomplish. But of course, when does this become obsolescent? When don't you need it? Remember, to rehabilitate the Eastern Front, that's as long as the war goes on. But the war ends at 11 a.m. on November 11th of 1918. At 11:01, the war of Allied intervention makes no sense anymore. And the pressure now to bring the boys home is great, but there's one man among the Allies who says, keep the pressure on the communist states, on the communist state. Keep the pressure on the Soviet Union, on the Soviet state. That man is the greatest of all Cold Warriors in the 20th century. That's Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill says that the British army should stay in Siberia, fighting against, again, the Soviet state. For Churchill says something like this: either we destroy communism in the cradle or communism will destroy us. What I'm saying to you is eventually all of the forces, including British forces, will be left. They'll be gone. They'll all withdraw. Popular discontent for having soldiers anywhere else besides Great Britain is great. Everybody, including the Japanese, ultimately will withdraw their forces. But it will leave, the war of Allied intervention will leave an indelible imprint on the Soviet psyche. The Soviets are very defensive to begin with. They envision themselves as a socialist island in a capitalist sea. Now, what's going to take place, again, perception is everything. What is going to take place now is a belief in the Soviet Union that will carry on in some ways down to the present day. But in 1918, 1919, 20 and 21 and 22, and throughout the 20s and through the 30s, the belief in the Soviet Union in the ranks of the Communist Party spread to the Soviet population. We are a socialist island in the capitalist sea. The capitalists have come to destroy us once, and they will come again and again and again. And we must do everything in our power to defend ourselves against them. This is a Soviet position which passes into the Soviet and to the Russian psyche, that in one way or another, it changes. The characters change, some of the ideas change, but this idea that the Soviet Union and later Russia is in a defensive position, it is a target for attacks and invasion. This is going to shape Soviet policy in the interwar period and in the war and long beyond the Second World War. So what do we have here? The Dolchstoss, the myth in the stab and the myth in the back. Then we have the war of Allied intervention. Then we have the enormous casualties. And then please keep this in mind. When the war is over, the great empires are done. The Romanov dynasty is finished. Now here, I'll give you parentheses. In March of 1918, Lenin ordered the execution of the Tsar, the Tsarina, and the imperial family. Now, why do these are about 10 people, 12 people at the most. Why is it significant? Sometimes, even when millions of people are dying, one or a small group of people, they seem to catch the public attention. 6 million dead Jews in the Holocaust, and who do most people remember? Anne Frank, right? Anne Frank, for most people in this world, most people believe that she represents the Holocaust. 6 million other dead Jews, this is the one that they remember. In the case of the Tsar and the Tsarina and the imperial family, again, millions of people are dying in World War I. The Tsar, well, in retrospect, the Tsar was not the sharpest tool in the shed, a good husband, a good father, very good husband, very good father, but an anti-Semite and a man that probably could have staved off the Russian revolutions had he been more conciliatory and really more flexible. But in the eyes of large numbers of people, how does a new government, like the Soviet government, how can it kill? How can it kill this beautiful family? And this is going to lead to tremendous hostility, public hostility towards the Soviet Union. Again, in the 20s and 30s, millions of people have died. The new communist government has established the Gulag, but it has elicited, that is, the Tsarist government has elicited enormous sympathy. On one of my trips, first to the Soviet Union and later to Russia, there was a public opinion poll asked in Russia, who are the greatest Russians of the 20th century? Who are the greatest people of the Soviet Union and Russia in the 20th century? The Poles alternated. You know who was number one sometimes? Stalin. And number two was Nicholas II. Unbelievable. This incompetent Tsar is now revered in many circles of the Russian state. He's been canonized. He's a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church. So the main point being here is the Romanov dynasty is no more. The Hohenzollern or the German dynasty is no more. The Habsburg Empire is no more. The Ottoman Empire is no more. History is always fluid. It's never stagnant. But now it becomes even more fluid than it ever was before. Everything is up for grabs now. I'll give you an example. On the very same day that World War I comes to an end, the George Washington of Poland, Joseph Pilsudski, proclaims Poland is now resurrected. There hadn't been a Poland since 1795. In the 18th century, Poland was partitioned 3 times, 1772, 1793, 1795. The Russians, the Prussians, the Habsburgs, they had all partitioned Poland. There was no Poland between 1795 and November 11th, 1918. Pilsudski is going to proclaim an independent Poland. There will soon be an independent Czechoslovakia. There will soon be claims all over the world. In the Middle East, the Egyptians should have Egypt, the Syrians should have Syria. All of this was the possessions either of the British Empire, the French Empire, or the Ottoman Empire. It's all done now. The great empires are going to be gone. And history now is going to turn in a very, very significant way. There are also some other political consequences that will resonate in our country and in Great Britain, and in France to a certain extent. The participation of women in the war effort will further the aspirations of those women in both Britain and the United States that want the right to vote. It is no coincidence that women are given the right to vote in Britain and the United States in the immediate aftermath of World War I. And then something very interesting. The temperance movement in our country was always strong. There were always people that thought liquor is the ultimate evil. The country should go on prohibition. And it gets prohibition almost immediately after World War I, because the people who advocate prohibition now have new weapons. Not only does it break up the family, not only does it lead to disease and destruction and accidents, that is alcoholism, but now there's a further argument. We should ban the sale of alcohol because it's not good for our soldiers at the front. We should ban the sale of alcohol because it disrupts work in the factories producing for the war effort. So here you have these two very significant social changes taking place as a consequence of World War I. Again, women have the right, getting the right to vote in Great Britain and the United States, and prohibition taking place in the United States with all of the consequences that flowed from that. And then there are the changes that take place. Some of them are really they're not funny. They are not funny. They are, but you'll be surprised. A new vocabulary is, for example, created. There's a word that people use now, a phrase that people use now that is used all the time. And I suspect that 99 and 9/10% of the people who use that term really never knew where it came from. When you see someone who is so distraught, cannot function, what do you call him or her? He or she is a basket case. The term basket case comes out of World War I. Remember the myths in war, the first casualty is the truth. There was a rumor, there was a belief that soldiers who had lost all 4 limbs had to be carried in baskets. There's no evidence that that was the case. In fact, in a study that was made right after the war in 1919, there's only 1 American soldier that lost 4 limbs in World War I. But the belief was that there were many soldiers who had lost 4 limbs and that they were carried in baskets, and sometimes that the baskets were hung from trees in order to get whatever the reason may have been. Remember the other myth that I told you about? That the Germans turned, when a battle was over, German reconnaissance people went onto the battlefield, took the corpses of dead British soldiers and turned them into soap. There's no evidence whatsoever that the Germans did that. Nor, I told you, and we'll come back to this again in the second series, there is no evidence whatsoever that the Germans turned dead Jews into soap. There is no evidence whatsoever. The Germans did many terrible atrocities, but that was not one of them. So, once again, I'm telling you, again, the term basket case, and then a term that I grew up with. My father used to tell me, Steve, take a shower. Because if you don't take a shower, you'll get the cooties. Cooties are the lice. That's a World War I term, a slang expression, cooties, for lice in the trenches. The idea, the fashion statement, the trench coat, where do you think that comes from? That's what British soldiers wore in the trenches. So that's one of, again, a new vocabulary. That's the least of it. There are changes that are taking place in terms of military technology. Aviation becomes far more sophisticated. You can't think of commercial aviation in the interwar period unless you learn about the improvements that took place during World War I. Transformations in the internal combustion engines. Cars become better. Trucks become better. All things that have an internal combustion engine are going to be much better. In the field of medicine, a certain number of changes are going to take place. First of all, a new way of using transfusions. People that were blood transfusions before the war, they were difficult. They become much easier to achieve as a consequence of the war. Plastic surgery. Men have their faces blown off in World War I. How are you going to deal with that? The first real significant plastic surgery on faces takes place in World War I. Psychiatry gets a boost. A new term is introduced. Again, you've all heard this, shell shock. You got to deal with those soldiers who are really, become, let's say, I'll use the World War I term, they become mental basket cases. How do you get people, how do you get them to recover? How do you get them to get put back in the line again? How do you get short-term therapy? All of this is going to come out of World War I. And then, again, new radios on the battlefield. All these things are going to take place. Telephone use on the battlefield. This is going to be a consequence of World War I. Gas warfare. Now that's important because out of World War I will come the belief that gas will be, in any future war, gas is going to be absolutely terrible. And everybody is going to bake poison gas in the interwar period. Why it is not used and why on one occasion it wasn't used, but it appeared on the battlefield in World War II, that's something that we'll talk about in the next course of lectures. But gas warfare, again, is going to develop. The use of the submarine, again, very, very significant. And certain other things, some social context, some social things. I remember reading in an American journal, a journal of American history. There was a memoir written by a doctor. Now, he was an old man. I think the article came out in the 60s or 70s. He was an old man by that time. And he's talking about an incident that occurred in the 1920s. When he's writing in the article, he's writing about, he had his residents, he said to the residents who were working under him, he said, come, I'm going to take you to a room where there's a soldier, there's a man there with a disease that we very rarely see, but we may see a lot of it in the future. The unfortunate soldier that they went to see was a soldier dying of lung cancer. Again, not too common a disease before World War I, but very common, lasting down into our present day, really very common in our own time. Again, a major cause of fatalities in our country, unfortunately. Where does it come from? Because one of the social changes in World War I is the massive distribution of cigarettes by both the British, the French, and the American armies. Cigarettes are given. It's a morale booster, given out by the millions upon millions of packs of cigarettes. Men who had never smoked before are now going to smoke, and they're going to smoke very, very earnestly. So, and then there's a problem. How do you stop the blood? Soldiers are wounded on the battlefield. How do you stop the blood? The sanitary gauze is created in World War I. A special type of napkin is created. That sanitary gauze becomes the sanitary napkin for women in the aftermath of World War I. So what I'm trying to tell you here, the war changes everything. Trotsky used to say, war is the locomotive of history. I tell my students, war is the midwife of change. War changes everything, absolutely everything. And one of the other political changes that is going to take place is, of course, the fear of communism. Again, for the third time, I'm telling you, if you want to come close to understanding the 20th century, it is this idea, again, you either have the fear of communism or the appeal of communism. Societies are pulverized by this. Even in our own country, close to 5,000 miles from the Soviet border, we will have Red Scare after Red Scare after Red Scare. We will have the House of Un-American Activities Committee. We will have all sorts of things taking place, the Hollywood blacklist. All of this is going to come as a consequence of the October Revolution. And those who fear communism will give enormous support to those who seem to be strongest in defeating communism or fighting communism. You cannot understand, again, we will deal with this in greater detail, the accession to power of Adolf Hitler on January 30th of 1933. Even earlier, Mussolini's March on Rome in the early 1920s. All of these men and others everywhere in the world, if communism has enormous appeal, again, the fear of communism is absolutely tremendous. And we might as well deal with this right now. Why do people fear communism? The answer is, again, it's not very complex. You've all heard this in one way or another, but let's be more specific. Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. This is an attack upon private property. What communism is calling for is a war between the haves and the have-nots. It's a war against private property. The second point here, there are two expressions in the Communist Manifesto which become accepted by the Soviet Union, adopted by the Soviet Union, and spread not only in Russia, not only in the Soviet state, but all over the world. The last sentence, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. In the middle of the Communist Manifesto is another famous statement. Religion is the opiate of the masses. Religion dulls the class consciousness of the masses. What I'm talking about, I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a theologian. What I'm saying to you is, when religion is at its best, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, makes no difference. We are all created in the image of God, right? Christians will say, we're brothers in Christ, right? That's what we will say. And the Jews say, or the famous expression from the Tanakh, are you not like the Ethiopians unto me? We are all equal. We're all created in the image of God. We're all brothers and sisters. Again, the homiletic interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve, we're all descended from a common father. We're all descended from a common mother. We're all brothers and sisters. And the Marxists say that's a crock. We're not all brothers and sisters. We're not brothers in Christ. The war is divided, say the Marxists. The war is divided between those who control the means of production and those who work for those who control the means of production. The war is divided in classes. And the way out of our misery is not faith. It's not a belief in God. It's not a belief in the hereafter, that the evil people will be punished and the eternal, their souls, the good people will live for eternity. The Marxist Leninist says that's absolute nonsense. It's hooey. You know when you'll be free, says the Marxist Leninist? When the workers take their guns and their rifles and their pitchforks and shove them in the fat bellies of the capitalists and create a socialist revolution, then and only then will we be free. The attack upon religion, the attack upon private property, the attack upon nationalism. The worker has no nation. The worker has the international proletariat. All of this is going to come out of World War I. So once again, my friends, this war changed everything, absolutely everything. In fact, we'll come back to this, well, I might as well say it to you now. On November 9th of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. It's the ultimate nail in the coffin of communism. And you know what people say? The more elegant historians say? When the Berlin Wall fell, this is the end of the 75-year centuries. 75-year century. What are the 75 years? 1914 to 1989. When the Berlin Wall fell, that is the end of communism. You could argue the last consequence of World War I in Europe. The most elegant way of saying that is when the Berlin Wall fell, it marked the triumph of the Marseillaise over the Internationale. It showed that the more important revolution was the French Revolution and not the Communist Revolution. For the ideas of the French Revolution, liberalism and democracy, self-determination, all of those things come out of the French Revolution, and they have an enormous impact upon Europe and upon the world. So, my friends, we have come to the end of a discussion of World War I. I had to pick my shots here, talking about the most important battles, the consequences, again, the diplomacy of the war. And again, for those who are Jewish, for those who are supporters of the State of Israel, I said this to you before when I talked to you about the Balfour Declaration. We may curse the British from today until doomsday. They did not behave well in the interwar period. They restricted immigration when the Holocaust, so the apocalypse was descending upon our people. In the struggle in 45, 46, 47, and 48, the British tilted on the side of the Arabs. That's incontrovertible. But make no mistake, without the Balfour Declaration, in the midst of World War I, November 2nd of 1917, there is no Jewish state. There's no state of Israel in 1948. For the British government did what, again, I mentioned, it's so important in the history of the Jewish people. This is the 20th century analog to the Edict of Cyrus, in the year 538 before the Common Era. Because the British, for the first time in modern history, a great power, stood behind Zionism. Not going to last too long, but it lasts long enough. So once again, my friends, I thank you for joining me. If I've left out things, you want to raise them in questions, I'd be delighted, absolutely delighted to talk this over with you. What I have not yet discussed is the Treaty of Versailles. That's what we're going to be talking about next week. Ferdinand Foch, who was the overall commander of all Allied forces in World War I, by the end of an Operation Michael, everything collapses. And for the first time, the British and the Americans agree there'll be one man that calls the shots, and that's Ferdinand Foch. And you know, first, Pershing even gives 4 American divisions. For the first time, American divisions are placed under a foreign commander. But you know what Foch said? After the war was over, when everybody is acclaiming victory, Foch said, very presciently, this is a 20-year armistice. That's all it is. That's one of the great prophecies of the 20th century. And why and how the Second World War began, that, my friends, is the topic for next Sunday. Let it rip, Ari. I'm open.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for taking us through World War I and preparing us for World War II. And a few questions that I've noted. Please feel free to chat them right now. We have just a few minutes. One question is, was communism inevitable in Russia? And the corollary was, why Russia first and not another country in Europe?
Those are two very good questions. I must tell you, the questions I get here are very, very good. They're better than the questions I get at school. And the kids at Union are good students. Nothing is inevitable, Ari. Nothing is inevitable. If the historian learns one lesson more than any other, never, never say never. Things happen. They just happen. Again, I'll just give you an example. I think I've mentioned this to you before. Two examples, very, very quick. 1975, Time magazine publishes an article on your country here, Ari, South Africa. And a group of Afrikaners were asked in 1975 by Time magazine, what will you do if the blacks rise? And you know what the Afrikaners said? Quote, here's the direct quote, which I remember. I can't believe I remember it, but I remember it. We will ride till our stirrups are filled with blood. We'll never give in to the blacks. Well, Nelson Mandela comes, boom, apartheid goes into the garbage can of history. Every Soviet specialist and Russian specialist believed that the Soviet Union would disappear, that would continue, not disappear, ultimately would disappear. But everyone, including myself, believed that the Soviet Union would last well into the 21st century because of the intimidation and really coercion by the Communist Party, the KGB, and the Red Army. March 1985, Gorbachev comes to power. 1991, the Soviet Union again disappears into the garbage can of history. So it wasn't inevitable. Things could have changed. Lenin could have been assassinated. Kerensky could have pulled Russia out of the war. Nothing was inevitable. Why in Russia more than anywhere else? Well, the Russians bore the burden of the war greater than anybody else. Russian casualties, only heaven knows how many Russian soldiers, Imperial Russian Army soldiers died in the war. The Civil War, again, a war between the haves and the have-nots. Again, a large proletariat laboring under terrible, absolutely terrible circumstances, 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week, food shortages and rationing. And then, of course, how I began the whole lecture series with you. And what I tell the students the first day of every class that I teach at Union, never, never, never minimize the role of personality in history. Even Trotsky, a Marxist-Leninist, who talks about the internal contradictions of capitalism and the inevitability of a socialist revolution. Even Trotsky says, if Lenin was not there, the Bolsheviks would never have come to power. So, in addition to everything I said to you about why in Russia, you get the role of personality. There's nobody in the socialist movement anywhere in the world that has the charisma and the ability to change history in their countries that Lenin has in Russia. Go ahead, Aaron.
So the related question was, what about other countries in Europe? How close were they to
the only country that has a revolution, and it doesn't last long, is Belakun. Belakun operating in Hungary. For about 6 months, there will be a communist government in Hungary. Now, you had a weekend with another professor. I'm sure he told you that Belakun is the Hungarian name for Belakon. And like Trotsky, remember I said this to you before, the problem with this is, again, the major factor in 20th century anti-Semitism, perhaps the major factor, certainly a very important factor, is the linkage of Jews with communism. The overwhelming majority of Jews were either non-communist or anti-communist, but a disproportionate number of the communists were Jews. Belakun, who did Belakun? Did he think that people think he was a Hungarian? Everybody knew he was a Jew. And therefore, Hungarian anti-Semitism, which was there, because it's there everywhere, is going to get a tremendous stimulus. That's why there's going to be a whole series of anti-Semitic laws. Belakun's government will be overthrown by an army led by the man on the white horse, Admiral Horthy. We'll talk more about him in the Second World War when we talk about the Holocaust. So everywhere, there's an old Soviet joke. You know what the joke is? Zinoviev, who is Jewish, says to Kamenev, who is Jewish, who says to Trotsky, who is Jewish, who says to Sokolnikov, who is Jewish, let's kick Lenin out, we'll have a minion. Again, most Jews in Russia were not communist or anti-communist, but a substantial number of them were communist, and they were in high places. The first president of the Soviet Union was a Jew. So the point here in being here, it's just that linkage of communism with Jews, but it fails everywhere else. Only in Hungary, and it doesn't last very long. There's an attempt in the new Czechoslovakia. That doesn't work. There's an attempt in Germany by Rosa Luxemburg and her lover, Karl Liebknecht, to carry out a communist revolution in Berlin. They end up, their bodies are in a river, in the Spree River in Berlin. So there are attempts everywhere. Only in Hungary does it succeed. But it only succeeds for a short period of time.
So thank you for following up. That does tie into our series of 4 Jewish revolutionaries that we had at our CSP adult retreat with Professor Howard Lupovich. A question that I don't think Howard answered, but maybe you can attempt, is even though, as you mentioned, most Jews were against social change because of their fear of what it might bring.
No, they were not afraid of social change. They were afraid of communism. They were not. What Jews historically are afraid of is violence. Even if the violence is well-intentioned against the Tsar, against anybody that they're Jews, Jews instinctively, in most cases, they are right. That violence, even for a noble cause, a cause that the Jews would support, violence very often ends with an attack upon Jews. The best example of that are the assassination of the Tsar by the revolutionary movement in Russia. Now, what does it end with? Pogroms against the Jews. Go ahead, Ari. I didn't mean to cut you off. Forgive me for that.
No, thank you for that. I guess the question is, why are there so many Jews disproportionately involved in these movements?
That is a very interesting question. And it is, again, communism says, look, communism believes that anti-Semitism is a function of the capitalist system. You don't have to be a wizard of logic to come to the conclusion. If anti-Semitism is a product of capitalism, if you eliminate capitalism, anti-Semitism will come to an end. So, not only will anti-Semitism come to an end, I have a copy of a poster in my office from the October Revolution. It's a very, very nice, very colorful poster. And in the poster is a woman on a pedestal. The woman is on a pedestal, and holding her hand is obviously a man who is a member of the proletariat. And underneath it says in Russian, having eliminated capitalism, a product of capitalism, prostitution will come to an end. In other words, prostitution comes, the belief is, the communists are saying, the belief is, again, communism, prostitution will come to an end. There'll be a redistribution of property. There'll be no poverty. All of those people who live very well like we do, again, all of our wealth will be shared. These are the things. They're very, very appealing. Why shouldn't large numbers of Jews? It will be an end to anti-Semitism. It will redistribute property. Despite what the anti-Semites say, the overwhelming majority of Jews in Eastern Europe, that's in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the vast majority of Jews were dirt poor. Forgive me for being crude, they didn't have that proverbial pot to piss in. Why shouldn't? Now you come to something else, since you're raising. Is there something in Judaism that leads some people to move to the left? Huh? What's the greatest statement of Jewish social ethics? You may not know it, but many who go to the synagogue know it. It's the portion from Isaiah. It is read in every Reform congregation, every Conservative, every Orthodox, every Haredi congregation, every Reconstructionist congregation. And what does Isaiah tell the people? What does he say that God has told him to tell the Jewish people of his time at all times? Now, this is not verbatim, but this is the thrust of what he's going to say. This is Judaism at its best, because Isaiah tells the Jews of all times, here's what God told me. You may fast from today until doomsday, and I will not listen to your prayers. You may wear white. You may take off your leather shoes, and I will not listen to your prayers. When will I listen to your prayers? When you feed the hungry, clothe the naked, take care of the widow and the orphan. Then I will listen to your prayers. For those who observe and use the Siddur and pray on a daily basis, what does the Psalm for Tuesday say? Champion the weak, champion the needy, feed the hungry. That's what it says. Judaism is replete with statements like that. Is this what leads some Jews to move into the ranks of the left? And remember, the liberalism of today is, or let's say, the conservatism of today is the liberalism of the early 19th century. Why did Jews, I was brought out to California, Howard. Believe it or not, one of my students was in the Trump White House, the first Trump White House. And she brings me out, not that I'm a Fabrenta conservative, I'll use the old language there. She brings me out to speak to young Republicans. And I knew what was going to happen. I knew what the first question was going to be. I spoke about Begin, about Jews and the state of Israel, and so on. I knew what the first question was going to be. Why do so many Jews vote Democratic? Right? Is it that we have a gene? Remember, I think I said this to you before. I say it to many people. If you haven't caught my accent, I'm from the golden land of Brooklyn, right? And if you're any doctors out there, remember, if you're born in Brooklyn, I'll tell you something you never learned in medical school. Ready for me, Howard? That is, if you're born in Brooklyn on chromosome 16, there's a gene that codes for the Democratic Party. You can't. So the arm withers if you try and vote Republican. Well, you go to California, there's a mutation. You go to Southern Florida, there's a mutation. But by and large, why is it? Liberalism has been good for the Jews. Historically, the question now is it still good for the Jews? That's what many people have to wrestle with in the Jewish community. But liberalism and the left have traditionally been good for the Jews. What's a constant between the liberalism of the early 19th century and the liberalism of our time? Whatever, there are many changes. Remember, the early liberalism of the 19th century said the government that governs least governs best. A liberal in 21st century America believes that government has an important role to play in our lives. A 19th century liberal would think that's anathema. But the one thing that is constant is the separation between church and state. And the idea that the relationship between an individual and God is a private matter, that the state does not have the right to intervene, that there should be no established church in our country. This is trite. You all learned this before, but that is powerful stuff. And that has benefited the Jewish people. And that's why Jews have moved to the left. That's why Jews are liberal. And the idealism again. How can you oppose, but going back to communism, how can you oppose the idea when they tell you that anti-Semitism will disappear? There'll be a redistribution of poverty, of wealth. The poor will disappear from the face of the earth. Heaven on earth, remember, this is a secular messianic movement. A Messiah saves. Communism will save humanity. And many Jews are going to fall into that. If you want to see, you know what I told you? Again, communism will end anti-Semitism. Communism will redistribute property, right? Communism will end prostitution. You know what else communism is going to end? Say the beliefs. Why are people mentally ill? No. Today we would say it's in the genes, whatever it may be, inherited stuff, pressure, whatever it may be. No. Communism says that mental illness is a consequence of the capitalist system, the ferocious oppression and the ferocious competition. That's what leads to mental illness. So if there's no capitalism anymore, there'll be no mental illness. If you want to see how this is played out, there's a remarkable film that talks about that. Not a documentary, it's a film, a commercial film. It's called Child 44. Child 44. See that film. That's late Stalinism, the late 1940s and the early 1940s. And it deals with a serial killer who kills children and the denial of the communist system. It can't be mental illness that led to this. It can't be. More than you ever wanted to know, I'm sorry.
Well,
Are there any other questions, Ari? I'll stay as long as you.
There's always questions, but I have to run as well. So people are
Oh.
thanking me and telling me to thank you for the series. It's a great way to stop as we prepare for World War II, because we're going to re-engage with communism as well. And I will say I was on the phone with Professor Jonathan Sarna right before this program, and he's going to be our 1-month scholar in residence next year. And one of his topics is going to be It's, you know, it's the 250th anniversary of America in 2026, and
Right.
we're going to
Get
explore.
better than Jonathan Somme.
We're going to explore American Judaism over the 250 years, and one of the topics he was just talking to me about was Jews and politics, and he said most people don't know that really in the early days Jews were not voting en masse for Democrats. In fact, they didn't really talk about politics as much, and they may have really been on both sides. So what happened in the early times? Why did it shift? And how did we get to what you talked about today, the Jewish gene in Brooklyn? So it's a perfect segue to that a year from now. How's that? You presaged something we'll be doing at CSP. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you
And
very, very much. Shalom uvracha, my friends. See you
take
next
care.
week.
Take care, everybody. Thank you, Professor
Bye-bye.
Berk. Have a great day. Enjoy the sun,
Thank you.
rain, sleet, snow, whatever you got. And we'll see
All in
you,
Florida. No sleet and snow here.
or move to Florida. Go to Boynton Beach. We'll see you all back here next week. It's a different time. It's 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. On the West Coast, and World War II is coming. It's inevitable. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Take care.